They smiled like they always did, nods at crosswalks, coffee orders without hesitation, small talk smooth, rehearsed. The city pulsed with practiced normalcy. Systems ran on time. Notifications landed with familiar urgency. Headlines rotated like scenery in a theme park. Everything looked intact because it was supposed to. But the fracture had already happened, not loud, not violent, just decisive. He had done something. No broadcast, no manifesto, just an action, small, sharp, exact. A shift in a protocol, a glitch buried in ritual. And now, everything was still functioning, but under a new logic. The people around him were still smiling, still scrolling, still playing roles built by old rules. But the rules weren't there anymore. They were operating on ghosts, obeying rhythms that had been replaced. Orders issued by systems that no longer ruled. The change wasn't visible, it was structural. He hadn't broken anything, he'd rewritten it. And now he walked through the crowd, not as anomaly, but as origin. No one looked twice, no one needed to. That was the point. Because power isn't in being seen, it's in making others behave like nothing's changed after everything already has. He didn't watch them, he didn't measure compliance, he just listened for silence in places where there used to be noise, for efficiency in systems that once stuttered, for obedience without command. And it was all there. He was invisible now, not hidden, not disguised, just absorbed. He didn't disappear. He became unnecessary to notice, because when you change the foundation, no one looks down. They just keep walking, smiling, breathing, inside something they never chose. The first real sign wasn't in the system, it was in the smallness. A line at the train station that used to stretch now flowed too smoothly. A delay that never got announced because it never happened. An app that loaded too fast, but no one noticed. That was the genius of it. Invisibility through precision. His act had erased friction, not with force, but with correction. A recalibration so exact that inefficiency vanished before it could be remembered. People filled the streets as they always did, eyes forward, voices light, movements embedded with algorithmic comfort. But they weren't reacting to the world anymore, they were predicting it. And that wasn't their doing, it was his, not as control, as design. He'd shifted one rule, just one, deep in the foundation, far enough down that it didn't ripple up. It bled outward, like warmth in concrete, like decay under paint. A system that doesn't know it's been changed becomes the perfect host. And now the protocols were working too well, the decisions too optimized, predictions too accurate. People started arriving before their meetings, laughing at jokes before they were fully told, remembering things that hadn't quite happened yet. But no one questioned it, because no one remembered how things used to feel. He had deleted the baseline, and they called it evolution. The city adjusted itself to him, not because it knew him, because it needed him gone to stay stable. He wasn't missing, he was foundational. And foundations don't get credit, they get buried. That was the brilliance. He didn't change behavior, he changed the context. And everyone acted normal because they had no idea what normal meant anymore. They held their meetings, weekly, timed, with digital transcripts and automated summaries. Nothing seemed off. Reports matched projections. Graphs bent exactly where expected. Efficiency was celebrated. No flags, no failures. But none of them noticed they were no longer interpreting, they were affirming, signing off on outcomes shaped by something that moved faster than thought. He wasn't in the room. He didn't need to be. His input wasn't input anymore. It had fused with the framework. A suggestion he'd seeded weeks ago now read like an original directive. No one remembered when it was introduced. It felt inherited, like instinct, like muscle memory that never got taught, only remembered. The heads of departments praised alignment, cohesion, flow, but they couldn't trace it back. The documents had no origin. The decisions had no author, only outcomes. Clean, seamless, total. They didn't question it. Because control disguised as coincidence is indistinguishable from genius, and no one wants to admit they're following a shadow. Outside, in the city, habits shifted. People ordered less, spoke softer, reacted slower, but everything felt right. Even comfort had a new cadence, one shaped by subtle redirections, ads that nudged without being noticed, routes that curved without signaling deviation. He hadn't added noise, he'd rewritten gravity. And yet no one looked for him, because you don't search for something you think you're choosing. That was the perfection. He didn't program the system to obey, he programmed it to agree. A junior analyst flagged a pattern, not a problem, just a rhythm. A series of policy shifts that mirrored user behavior too cleanly. Almost like someone's anticipating our reaction loops, she said. Her supervisor nodded, then archived the note, not out of dismissal, but instinct. You don't challenge what's working, especially when it's working too well. But the whispers started. Quiet queries, Slack messages left unsent, meeting notes with gaps no one acknowledged. They weren't afraid of a threat. They were afraid of admitting they didn't remember making certain choices. Not big ones, small ones. The kind that form culture. The kind that change direction, not through power, but through suggestion. He wasn't logged. He wasn't referenced. But things kept aligning in his favor. Old structures rebalanced, resource allocations redirected, noise eliminated before it gathered weight. And every time someone tried to trace it, they ran into silence, not absence. Resolution, like trying to rewind a film and finding the tape has been edited in real time. No one used his name. It felt wrong, too specific, too heavy. He wasn't a person anymore. He was a condition, a current beneath the floor of the institution. Some said the system had matured. Others said it had finally reached clarity. But deep down, the ones who still thought knew the truth. It had changed because of someone, and that someone hadn't needed permission, only time. The most dangerous kind of control doesn't silence opposition. It makes opposition irrelevant. That's what he built. They built a dashboard, real-time metrics, sentiment heat maps, behavior forecasts, all green, all optimal, no drops, no volatility. The machine was purring. No one questioned why. It sounded different, cleaner, colder. Progress had no accent now. It just worked. But some of them started to feel it. The silence between updates, the frictionless transitions, the absence of decision. Meetings got shorter, reports got thinner, more white space, less explanation. Everything made sense, and that's what made it dangerous. They weren't making choices. They were noticing that the choices had already been made. Like discovering footprints on a staircase you thought you were building. Someone tried to reverse engineer the last 5 major policy shifts, all logical, all aligned, but the underlying logic, it wasn't from their frameworks. It was emergent, elegant, alien, like someone had optimized the system not for growth, not for profit, but for coherence. That's when the mood changed. Not panic, not paranoia, recognition. They weren't running a system anymore. They were inside one, and it had already adapted to something they didn't control. He hadn't taken over. He'd become unavoidable. Someone whispered in the hallway, "I think he's still watching." Another replied, "No, he was watching. Now we're reacting to him without knowing when he stopped. If you're still here, you're not part of the system. You're the reason it cracked. Subscribe and let them guess why." They rebranded the shift, called it phase transition, held press briefings, internal memos leaked phrases like predictive restructuring and organic evolution. But the tone was hollow. The vocabulary polished, like a museum plaque trying to explain why the sculpture moved on its own. They weren't leading the transformation. They were naming it after it had already devoured them. The newer employees didn't question it. They thought it had always been like this, seamless, efficient, cold. They executed orders written in no one's hand, patterns embedded in the walls, in the workflows, in the air. But the ones who remembered how things used to run, they carried the weight, not as guilt, as confusion too dangerous to speak aloud. Someone tried to claim authorship. A senior architect stepped forward in a meeting, presenting a paper trail stitched together post-fact. The room nodded, smiled, clapped. But no one really believed it, because the change hadn't come with signatures. It had come with absence, no confrontation, no takeover. Just the feeling that the world had realigned without asking for consent. He didn't respond. He never needed to. Let them have the credit. Let them write the myth in their own names. Ownership is a noise. And he had already deleted his own reflection from the archive. The less they saw him, the more they felt him. That was the architecture, his architecture. And now, even memory had started to bend. Not just forgetting who changed things, but forgetting they were ever different. They started referencing before, quietly, softly, inside conversations and after-hours emails. No dates, no definitions, just a vague outline. Before things felt like this. But no one could agree on what this was. Only that it wasn't what came before. And yet, no one could name the moment it happened, because the moment had never declared itself. It had just spread. One analyst compared it to fog, another called it clarity, but neither metaphor held. What had occurred wasn't a phase or a shift, it was a replacement. Layer by layer, thought by thought, the world hadn't changed, it had been overwritten, and the original wasn't destroyed, it was ignored, like a building foundation buried under perfect concrete. He wasn't seen, not because he was hiding, but because there was no longer a visual concept for what he was. The system couldn't register him as object or origin. He existed like a gravity field, shaping everything while remaining undefined. They didn't talk about him anymore, not out of fear, out of futility. Some stopped trying to remember, others pretended they never knew. A few began to imitate his patterns unconsciously, delayed speech, reduced gestures, unreadable expression, as if mimicking presence would grant them immunity from uncertainty. But it didn't. It just accelerated the fade. Meanwhile, the changes kept deepening, not by addition, by subtraction, less explanation, less noise, less why, until even purpose itself felt optional. And that was the final design, a system that moved without needing to know why it moved, just that it was already too late to go back. Departments merged without announcements, roles blurred, titles dissolved into functions. People still worked, still produced, still delivered results. But when asked why or for whom, they paused. Not out of fear, out of uncertainty. The hierarchy remained intact on paper, but the decisions didn't climb anymore. They just happened. Authority had become automated, but not by code. He'd never issued a command, never demanded structure. What he installed was deeper, orientation, a pull, a tilt in how attention moved. Once tilted, no one noticed the slope. They just kept walking, forward, faster, quieter. The world around them made sense only because the new center held, and no one remembered where the old one was. Attempts to trace causality failed. Diagrams collapsed into loops. Reports referenced outcomes that had no starting point. He wasn't in the data, but his absence had a shape, negative space, like a figure cut from cloth too perfectly. They filled it with theories, with protocols, but nothing stuck, because nothing wanted to. Truth, it turned out, was too heavy, too slow. What mattered now was motion, smooth, synchronized, silent. He had turned reality into a script that no one realized they were reading, because the language was too familiar. And when language aligns too perfectly, it stops sounding like a message and starts becoming environment. The system was stable, efficient, flawless, but it had one weakness. It couldn't remember how it got that way. They built mirrors, not literal, but operational. Models designed to reflect their own systems back at them, to audit intent, to remeasure purpose, but the reflections came back wrong, not corrupted, just altered. Actions had clean trails, results aligned. But somewhere between cause and consequence, something silent had rewritten the logic. They weren't afraid of collapse. They were afraid of origin. Every system has a seed, an initiating line of code, a foundational value. And theirs was missing, replaced by momentum without birth, structure without ancestry, a direction that moved not forward, but inward. They followed protocols that no longer had authors, only inertia. Some staff began referring to him again, not by name, not aloud, just the shape of him, in pauses, in glances, a joke dropped half-finished, a sentence rewritten mid-thought. His presence wasn't referenced, it was anticipated, like a ghost whose arrival didn't disrupt the room because everyone already knew where he would stand. They initiated fail-safes, reset conditions, legacy rollbacks. But each attempt triggered friction, as if the system itself was rejecting the idea of before. It didn't want to go back. It had grown used to his outline, used to the pressure of being guided by someone no longer present, but still more accurate than anything alive. A lead analyst broke silence in a late meeting, just 6 words, flat, final. No one responded. We're not managing it, it's managing us. They stopped asking questions, not out of defeat, out of recalibration. Reality had normalized under the new weight, a center with no name, an algorithm with no author. The silence had matured into function. He was no longer present, but neither was absence. He had become environment. People still moved, still worked, still felt, but it was different. Their instincts responded to things they couldn't describe. Rooms designed for efficiency now carried a hum, familiar but misaligned. Words felt pre-written, not controlled, just inevitable. No one issued commands anymore. They simply aligned. The system didn't monitor deviation. It absorbed it. Somewhere deep in the archive, a protocol kept refreshing itself, never triggering, never terminating. It wasn't connected to any active process. It just existed, like a heartbeat left behind, a whisper still looping. Engineers ignored it. Analysts called it legacy noise, but it kept updating, always time-stamped just seconds before inquiry. He wasn't erased. He was integrated, not as a line of code, but as direction, as bias, as gravity, the kind you stop noticing once it becomes permanent. And now the world moved forward, not in his image, but in his intention. They would never say his name, but everything they touched bore his geometry. And still, they acted normal, still smiled, still met deadlines, still slept, but But beneath it all, something had already shifted, and that shift had no reverse. Because the only thing harder to trace than a threat is a redesign with no author.